Do you ever think about where Tyranids live? How when they infest a planet, they breed and multiply at an alarming rate, consuming your homeworld entirely and absorbing you into their genetic makeup? Me neither. But just in case you do, here's a few quick and easy steps to help you make your own Tyranid terrain to infest your own home, garden, or terrain table. Step 1. Buy a jigsaw and cut some random shapes out of some 1/8 inch MDF board. It's very important that you film none of this. Then, using your X-Acto knife, trim down the outsides of your little terrain shapes in order to create a nice smooth transition between the shapes themselves and any sort of board or place you might want to put these on. I plan on using this terrain for my Tyranids in 40k, but also for other games such as the tabletop skirmish game Reign in Hell, which just came out, as well as to represent corrupted hellscapes in games such as Age of Sigmar or Warcry. Step 2. Using your Olfa knife, cut some more random shapes out of insulation styrofoam. If you want to make this especially challenging for yourself, use a really dull knife like I'm using here, and then regret it later. Using the low temperature on your variable heat glue gun, glue the insulation foam both to itself and the MDF boards. Step 3. Build up your YouTube channel to the point where Loot Studios offers you a sponsorship. Download all of the STL files from their current bundle called Brains and Tentacles, and select the ones that you think would look best in your hive fleet. Once you've selected the files that you like the most, ask a friend to print out just an absurd amount of these so that you can make your project bigger than you have time to do within a week. Once you have all the parts in hand, you can then glue them down on top of your styrofoam to create some Tyranid terrain. And that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching. If you want to make something a little bit more elaborate, we can move on to step 4, which is to move all of this stuff into the living room because we're running out of space in this tiny room to make something as big as we're planning on making. Once we're in the living room, you can see what the whole board is going to look like and start building up more of the shapes out of styrofoam to match the ones that you envisioned in your dreams last night. Next, spend the next few days cutting circular shapes out of styrofoam because you've just realized that the hive demands it of you, and circular shapes are just more pleasing to the swarm than more rigid shapes with hard edges. You can start by cutting 1,000,000 squares out of styrofoam and then file off the edges to make them into circles. I should also mention that you should be wearing protective eyewear for this task, because sometimes the blade will shoot out and you don't want to get an Olfa blade in your eye. Be really careful with Olfa knives. Next, using an Olfa knife, you can start filing down some of the shapes that you want to be more smooth on the inside. This will give your spires a more cylindrical, organic looking shape, and will make it easier for your brood to climb up and down the spires. On the opposite side, cut inwards towards the top of each piece of styrofoam to create the look of a ancient carapace. Step 6. Using a very sharp... Hey, come on. Mute your Discord so that none of the noises from your computer are going to get onto the camera. Step 8, and this is the fun part. Use all of the remaining pieces of 3D printed Tyranid terrain to decorate the board and just have a lot of fun with it. Here you can see I'm combining these styrofoam balls with some 3D printed pillars to create some all-seeing eyes to make sure we can sense anything that might be invading our hive space. I'm also using just a ridiculous amount of hot glue at this point to glue down all sorts of marbles and beads to create little growths and eggs that are coming out of our little hive to make sure everything looks a little bit more populated and textury. Don't be afraid to use too much hot glue here. On average, I would say use twice as much hot glue as you think you need. After you're done bedazzling all of your terrain in gems and decorations, you can then, using a proper ventilation mask, create little patterns in the styrofoam terrain by using the tip of your hot glue gun on its low temperature setting. Step 9. Spread cream cheese all over your terrain to smooth out the styrofoam parts into the wooden parts and 3D printed parts. This is going to help insulate your eggs as well as serve as an easy source of protein for your Tyranid hatchlings when they hatch. If you don't have cream cheese, you can always use Sculptamold, which is a sort of plaster that you can add water to create a similar texture to cream cheese, but it isn't nearly as edible and it doesn't insulate your eggs nearly as well. Also, feel free to mix up your cream cheese by adding some little rocks and things to make some nice ground scatter for your terrain. Once your cream cheese is fully dry, you can then use your hot glue gun to create veins throughout the ground to make sure each of your bioorganic structures are connected to one another through a network of bioorganic fluid. If your terrain doesn't look like a living thing, then you're doing it wrong, so add more veins. Once everything is dry, we can start painting it however we want. But before we move forward, I really need to do an ad spot here, so I'm just going to remind myself to record that later. If you somehow don't know about Loot Studios already, they were the ones that got me hooked on 3D printing in the first place. And I still think they have one of the most compelling business models in the 3D printing space today. Every month, they offer what I would call a deluxe playset, including 3 new heroes, 2 new NPCs, as well as just a ton of monsters, scatter terrain, as well as 5th edition stats to go along with everything. If I was running a D&D campaign today, I would be making heavy use of Loot Studios content every month. But even if you're more of a wargamer or terrain builder like me, you can still see the utility of their service for any game that you're playing. This month's bundle is called Brains and Tentacles, and I think it's a great value. If you're interested, I would suggest buying it right now, as it's only going to be this cheap until the end of June, after which they'll be featuring a brand new bundle and a whole new set of miniatures. So if you're interested, go and check it out, the link is in the description. You can paint this however you want, and I would really recommend that you paint it to match the rest of your hive fleet, but I opted for something rather simple here, starting with a nice primer that is a 50-50 mix of cheap black acrylic paint and Mod Podge. This will create a nice hard black shell to insulate the entire build and allow us to paint other stuff on top of it. After this was done, I tried to do the same thing with some white paint and Mod Podge to paint some of the glowing bits, but it didn't work half as well. I ended up just using my airbrush and some white ink to paint all of these parts. After this was done, I spent a long time coming up with a lot of different test schemes for this Tyranid terrain, and I ended up going with something that was really easy to replicate and quick to do because there's quite a lot of this terrain to paint, and I only have so much time to hatch 1 million Tyranids. Complete this video. Here's the final paint scheme that I came up with. First, dry brush pale sand pretty heavily over the entire terrain. Next, spray a glaze of Achillean green contrast paint over top of all of the areas that aren't going to be glowing. Next, spray some yellow contrast paint over all the parts that you want to be glowing. Finally, spray some red contrast paint to help make the yellow more into an orange, and also to add some variety to all of the terrain and to make it look like the veins and stuff are living things. Finally, to give everything a sort of alien sheen, I took some color shifting paint and just sprayed it onto some various areas of the rocks and stuff around the terrain. You could add further washes or highlights, but I think this actually looks pretty good, so I'm going to call it done. And that's how you make Tyranid terrain, or hell terrain, or chaos terrain, or whatever you want to call it. And with 10 of these finished, this brings my miniature golf score all the way down to 98 points. If you don't know what I'm talking about, please check out last week's video where we talk about the rules for miniature shame golf. Thank you so much to Loot Studios for sponsoring this video, and feel free to check out the link in the description if you want to get some of this brains and tentacles type of terrain for yourself. I'd also like to thank all of my generous patrons for their lovely support. I really couldn't be doing this without you. This week, I'd especially like to thank Benjamin Simonet, Lex Noren, Dion Velasco, Michael Hagen, David Dahlberg, and Ben. If you'd like to get access to bonus content like the Patreon exclusive Discord, your name in the credits, and things like that, you can do so at patreon.com/DanaHowl. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.